1. For the people. I still remember the first time I walked to the Alameda County Superior Courthouse in Oakland, California, as an employee. It was 1988 during the last summer of law school, and I, along with 9 others, had been offered a summer internship in the district attorney's office. I had a sense that I wanted to be a prosecutor, that I wanted to be on the front lines of criminal justice reform, that I wanted to protect the vulnerable. But having never seen the job up close, I hadn't made up my mind. The sun shone brightly on the courthouse. The building stood apart on Lake Merritt, taller and more regal than other buildings nearby. From certain angles, it looked like an architectural marvel from a foreign capital, with its granite base and concrete tower rising to meet a golden rooftop. Though from other angles, it bore an uncanny resemblance to an Art Deco wedding cake. Stop it. The Alameda County District Attorney's Office is itself something of a legend. Earl Warren led the office before becoming Attorney General of California and later one of the most influential Chief Justices of the United States Supreme Court. He was on my mind that morning as I walked past the stunning mosaics in the lobby that depict the early history of California. Warren's words, proclaiming segregation inherently unequal, had taken a long 15 years to make it to Berkeley, California. I was grateful they had come in time for me. My elementary school class was only the second class in my city to be desegregated through busing. I was the first to arrive at the orientation session. Within a few minutes, the rest of my fellow clerks showed up. There was only one woman among them, Amy Resner. As soon as the session was over, I went up to her and asked her for her phone number. In that male-dominated environment, it was refreshing to have at least one female colleague. She remains one of my closest friends today, and I'm godmother to her children. As summer interns, we understandably had very little power or influence. Our job was primarily to learn and observe while assisting where we could. It was a chance to get a taste of how the criminal justice system worked from the inside, what it looked like when justice was served, and when it wasn't. I didn't like that. What it looked like when justice was served, and when it wasn't. That's money, bro. We were placed with attorneys who were trying all kinds of cases, from DUIs to homicides, and had the chance to be in the room and part of the process of putting together a case. I'll never forget the time my supervisor was working on a case involving a drug bust. The police had arrested a number of individuals in the raid, including an innocent bystander, a woman who had been at the wrong place at the wrong time and had been swept up in the dragnet. I hadn't seen her. I didn't know who she was or what she looked like. I didn't have any connection to her except for the report I was reviewing. But there was something about her that caught my attention. It was late on a Friday afternoon, and most people had gone home for the weekend. In all likelihood, a judge wouldn't see her until Monday. That meant she'd have to spend the weekend in jail. Not good. Does she work weekends? Is she going to have to explain to her employer where she was? Is she going to get fired? Even more important, I knew she had young children at home. Do they know she's in jail? They must think she did something wrong. Who's taking care of them right now? Is there even someone who can? Child Protective Services might get called. My God, she could lose her kids. Everything was on the line for this woman. Her family, her livelihood, her standing in her community, her dignity, her liberty. And yet she'd done nothing wrong. I rushed to the clerk of the court and asked to have the case called that very day. I begged. I pleaded. If the judge could just return to the bench for 5 minutes, we could get her released. All I could think about was her family and her frightened children. I watched and listened as he reviewed her case, waiting for him to give the order. Then, with the pound of a gavel, just like that, she was free. She'd get to go home to her children in time for dinner. I never did get the chance to meet her, but I'll never forget her. It was a defining moment in my life. It was the crystallization of how, even on the margins of the criminal justice system, the stakes were extraordinarily high and intensely human. It was a realization that, even with the limited authority of an intern, people who cared could do justice. Where did my thing go? It was revelatory, a moment that proved how much it mattered to have compassionate people working as prosecutors. Years before I'd be elected to run a major prosecutor's office, this was one of the victories that mattered the most. I knew she was going home. And I knew the kind of work I wanted to do. And who I wanted to serve. The courthouse wasn't far from where I grew up. I was born in Oakland, California in 1964, and spent the formative years of my childhood living on the boundary between Oakland and Berkeley. My father, Donald Harris, was born in Jamaica in 1938. He was a brilliant student who immigrated to the United States after being admitted to the University of California at Berkeley. He went there to study economics and would go on to teach economics at Stanford, where he remains a professor emeritus. My mother's life began thousands of miles to the east, in southern India. Shyamala, Gopalan, was the oldest of 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Like my father, she was a gifted student, and when she showed a passion for science, her parents encouraged and supported her. She graduated from the University of Delhi at 19, and she didn't stop there. She applied to a graduate program at Berkeley, a university she'd never seen in a country she'd never visited. It's hard for me to imagine how difficult it must have been for her parents to let her go. Commercial jet travel was only just starting to spread globally. It wouldn't be a simple matter to stay in touch. Yet, when my mother asked permission to move to California, my grandparents didn't stand in the way. She was a teenager when she left home for Berkeley in 1958 to pursue a doctorate in nutrition and endocrinology on her way to becoming a breast cancer researcher. My mother was expected to return to India after she completed her degree. Her parents had an arranged marriage. It was assumed my mother would follow a similar path. But fate had other plans. She and my father met and fell in love in Berkeley while participating in the Civil Rights Movement. At Berkeley, while participating in the Civil Rights Movement. Her marriage and her decision to stay in the United States were the ultimate acts of self-determination and love. My parents had 2 daughters together. My mother received her PhD at age 25, the same year I was born. My beloved sister Maya came 2 years later. Family lore has it that in both pregnancies, my mother kept working right up to the moment of delivery. One time her water broke while she was at the lab, and the other while she was making apple strudel. In both cases, knowing my mom, she would have insisted on finishing up before she went to the hospital. Those early days were happy and carefree. I loved the outdoors, and I remember that when I was a little girl, my father wanted me to run free. He would turn to my mother and say, "Just let her run, Shyamala." And then he'd turn to me and say, "Run, Kamala, as fast as you can, run." I would take off, the wind in my face, with the feeling that I could do anything. It's no wonder I also have many memories of my mother putting band-aids on my scraped knees. Music filled her home. My mother loved to sing along to gospel, from Aretha Franklin's early work to the Edwin Hawkins singers. She'd won an award in India for her singing, and I loved hearing that voice. My father cared about music just as much as my mother. He had an extensive jazz collection, so many albums that they filled all the shelving against one of the walls. Every night I would fall asleep to the sounds of Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, or Miles Davis. But the harmony between my parents didn't last. In time, things got harder. They stopped being kind to each other. I knew they loved each other, I know they loved each other very much, but it seemed they'd become like oil and water. By the time I was 5 years old, the bond between them had given way under the weight of incompatibility. They separated shortly after my dad took a job at the University of Wisconsin, and divorced a few years later. They didn't fight about money. The only thing they fought about was who got the books. I've often thought that had they been a little older, more emotionally mature, maybe the marriage could have survived. But they were so young. My father was my mother's first boyfriend. It was hard on both of them. I think for my mother, the divorce represented a kind of failure she had never considered. Her marriage was as much an act of rebellion as an act of love. Explaining it to her parents had been hard enough. Explaining the divorce, I imagine, was even harder. I doubt they ever said to her, "I told you so," but I think those words echoed in her mind regardless. Maya was still a toddler at the time of their separation, a little too young to understand what was going on, to feel the hardness of it all. I have often felt a pang of guilt because of something Maya never got to experience. I knew our parents when they were happy together. Maya never really did. My father remained a part of our lives. We would see him on weekends and spend summers with him in Palo Alto. But it was really my mother who took charge of our upbringing. She was the one most responsible for shaping us into the women we would become. And she was extraordinary. My mother was barely 5'1", but I felt like she was 6'2". She was smart and tough and fierce and protective. She was generous, loyal, and funny. She had only 2 goals in life: to raise her 2 daughters and to end breast cancer. She pushed us hard and with high expectations as she nurtured us. And all the while, she made Maya and me feel special, like we could do anything we wanted to if we put in the work. My mother had been raised in a household where political activism and civic leadership came naturally. Her mother, my grandmother, Rajam Gopalan, had never attended high school, but she was a skilled community organizer. She would take in women who were being abused by their husbands, and then she'd call the husbands and tell them they'd better shape up or she would take care of them. She used to gather village women together, educating them about conception. My grandfather, P.V. Gopalan, had been part of the movement to win India's independence. Eventually, as a senior diplomat in the Indian government, he and my grandmother had spent time living in Zambia after it gained independence, helping to settle refugees. He used to joke that my grandmother's activism would get him in trouble one day. But he knew that was never going to stop her. From them, my mother learned that it was service to others that gave life purpose and meaning. And from my mother, Maya and I learned the same. My mother inherited my grandmother's strength and courage. People who knew them knew not to mess with either. And from both of my grandparents, my mother developed a keen political consciousness. She was conscious of She was conscious of history, conscious of struggle, conscious of inequities. She was born with a sense of justice imprinted on her soul. My parents often brought me in a stroller with them to civil rights marches. I have young memories of a sea of legs moving about, of the energy and shouts and chants. Social justice was a central part of family discussions. My mother would laugh telling a story she loved about the time when I was fussing as a toddler. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to soothe me. "Freedom," I yelled back. My mother surrounded herself with close friends who were really more like sisters. My godmother, a fellow Berkeley student whom I knew as Aunt Mary, was one of them. They met through the civil rights movement that was taking shape in the early 1960s and was being debated and defended from the streets of Oakland to the soapboxes of Berkeley's Sproul Plaza. As black students spoke out against injustice, a group of passionate, keenly intelligent, politically engaged young men and women found one another, my mother and Aunt Mary among them. They went to peaceful protests where they were attacked by police with hoses. They marched against the Vietnam War and for civil rights and voting rights. They went together to see Martin Luther King Jr. speak at Berkeley, and my mother had a chance to meet him. She told me that at one anti-war protest, the marchers were confronted by the Hells Angels. She told me that at another, she and her friends were forced to run for safety, with me in a stroller, after violence broke out against the protesters. But my parents and their friends were more than just protesters. They were big thinkers, pushing big ideas, organizing their community. Aunt Mary, her brother, my Uncle Freddie, my mother and father, and about a dozen other students organized a study group to read the black writers that the university was ignoring. They met on Sundays at Aunt Mary and Uncle Freddie's Harmon Street home, where they devoured Ralph Ellison. Shout out to Ralph Ellison. Discussed Carter G. Woodson, debated W.E.B. Du Bois. They talked about apartheid, about African decolonization, about liberation movements in the developing world, and about the history of racism in America. But it wasn't just talking. There was an urgency to their fight. They received prominent guests, too, including civil rights and intellectual leaders from Leroy Jones to Fannie Lou Hamer. After Berkeley, Aunt Mary took a job teaching at San Francisco State University, where she continued to celebrate and elevate the black experience. SFSU had a student-run experimental college, and in 1966, another of my mother's dear friends, whom I knew as Uncle Aubrey, taught the college's first-ever class in black studies. The campus was a proving ground for redefining the meaning and substance of higher education. These were my mother's people. In a country where she had no family, they were her family. And she was theirs. From almost the moment she arrived from India, she chose and was welcomed to and enveloped in the black community. It was the foundation of her new American life. Along with Aunt Mary, Aunt Lenore was my mother's closest confidant. I also cherish the memory of one of my mother's mentors, Howard, a brilliant endocrinologist who had taken her under his wing. When I was a girl, he gave me a pearl necklace that he'd brought back from a trip to Japan. Pearls have been one of my favorite forms of jewelry ever since. I was also very close to my mother's brother, Balu, and her two sisters, Sarala and Chini, whom I called Chitty, which means younger mother. They lived many thousands of miles away, and we rarely saw one another. Still, through many long-distance calls, our periodic trips to India, and letters and cards written back and forth, our sense of family, of closeness and comfort and trust, was able to penetrate the distance. It's how I first really learned that you can, have very close relationships with people, even if it's not on a daily basis. We were always there for one another, regardless of what form that would take. My mother, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and uncle instilled us with pride in our South Asian roots. Our classical Indian names harked back to our heritage, and we were raised with a strong awareness of and appreciation for Indian culture. All of my mother's words of affection or frustration came out in her mother tongue, which seems fitting to me, since the purity of those emotions is what I associate with my mother most of all. My mother understood very well that she was raising two black daughters. She knew that her adopted homeland would see Maya and me as black girls, and she was determined to make sure we would grow into confident, proud black women. About a year after my parents separated, we moved into the top floor of a duplex on Bancroft Way, in a part of Berkeley known as the Flatlands. It was a close-knit neighborhood of working families who were focused on doing a good job, paying the bills, and being there for one another. It was a community that was invested in its children, a place where people believed in the most basic tenet of the American dream, that if you work hard and do right by the world, your kids will be better off than you are. We weren't rich in financial terms, but the values we internalized provided a different kind of wealth. My mom would get Maya and me ready every morning before heading to work at her research lab. Usually she'd mix up a cup of Carnation instant breakfast. We could choose chocolate, strawberry, or vanilla. On special occasions, we got Pop-Tarts. From her perspective, breakfast was not the time to fuss around. She would kiss me goodbye, and I would walk to the corner and get on the bus to Thousand Oaks Elementary School. I only learned later that we were part of a national experiment in desegregation, with working-class black children from the Flatlands being bused in in one direction and wealthier white children from the Berkeley Hills bus in the other. At the time, all I knew was that the big yellow bus was the way I got to school. Looking at the photo of my first grade class reminds me of how wonderful it was to grow up in such a diverse environment. Because the students came from all over the area, we were a varied bunch. Some grew up in public housing and others were the children of professors. I remember celebrating varied cultural holidays at school and learning to count to 10 in several languages. I remember parents, including my mom, volunteering in the classroom to lead science and art projects with the kids. Mrs. Frances Wilson, my first grade teacher, was deeply committed to her students. In fact, when I graduated from the University of California Hastings College of the Law, there was Mrs. Wilson sitting in the audience, cheering me on. Wow, they're going for two. Okay. When Maya and I finished school, I apologize, y'all. Get that. Our mother would often still be at work, so we would head 2 houses down to the Sheltons, who my mother knew through Uncle Aubrey, and with whom we shared a long-standing relationship of love, care, and connection. Regina Shelton, originally from Louisiana, was Aubrey's aunt. She and her husband Arthur, an Arkansas transplant, owned and ran a nursery school, first located in the basement of their own home, and later underneath our apartment. The Sheltons were devoted to getting the children in our neighborhood off to the best possible start in life. Their daycare center was small but welcoming, with posters of leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman on the wall. The first George Washington Maya and I learned about when we were young was George Washington Carver. We still laugh about the first time Maya heard a classroom teacher talk about President George Washington, and she thought to herself proudly, "I know him. He's the one who worked with peanuts." The Sheltons also ran an after-school program in their home, and that's where Maya and I would spend our afternoons. We simply called it going to the house. The house. These in quotes there. There were always children running around at the house. Lots of laughter and joyful play. Maya and I grew incredibly close to Mrs. Shelton's daughter and foster children. We'd pretend that we were all going to marry the Jackson Five. Maya with Michael and me with Tito. Love you, Tito. Mrs. Shelton would quickly become a second mother to Maya and me. Elegant and warm in equal measure, she brought her traditional Southern style to her grace and hospitality, not to mention her pound cake and flaky biscuits, which I adored. She was also deeply thoughtful in both senses of the term, exceptionally smart and uncommonly generous. I'll never forget the time I made lemon bars to share. I had spent one afternoon making a lemon bar recipe that I found in one of my mother's cookbooks. They had turned out beautifully, and I was excited to show them off. I put them on a plate, covered them with saran wrap, and walked over to Mrs. Shelton's house, where she was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea and laughing with her sister, Aunt Bea, and my mother, Bea. I proudly showed off my creation to them, and Mrs. Shelton took a big bite. It turned out I had used salt instead of sugar, but not having tasted them myself, I didn't know. Honey, Mrs. Shelton responded in her graceful Southern accent, her lips slightly puckered from the taste. That's delicious. Maybe a little too much salt, but really delicious. I didn't walk away thinking I was a failure. I walked away thinking I had done a great job, and just made one small mistake. It was little moments like those that helped me build a natural sense of confidence. I believed I was capable of anything. Mrs. Shelton taught me so much. She was always reaching out to mothers who needed counseling, or support, or even just a hug, because that's what you do. She took in more foster children than I can remember, and adopted a girl named Sandy who would become my best friend. She always saw the potential in people. I love that about her too. She invested in neighborhood kids who had fallen through the cracks, and she did it with the expectation that these struggling boys and girls could be great. And yet she never talked about it or dwelled on it. To her, these deeds were not extraordinary. They were simply an extension of her values. When I would come home from the Sheltons, I'd usually find my mother reading or working on her notes, or preparing to make us dinner. Breakfast aside, she loved to cook, and I loved to sit with her in the kitchen and watch and smell and eat. She had a giant Chinese-style cleaver that she chopped with, and a cupboard full of spices. I loved that okra could be soul food or Indian food, depending on what spices you choose. She would add dried shrimp and sausage to make it gumbo, or fry it up with turmeric and mustard seeds. My mother cooked like a scientist. She was always experimenting. An oyster beef stir-fry one night, potato latkes another. Latkes? It could be latchkey. Dude. Even my lunch became a lab for her creations. On the bus, my friends with their bologna sandwiches and PB&Js would ask excitedly, "Kamala, what you got?" I'd open the brown paper bag, which my mother always decorated with a smiley face or a doodle. Cream cheese and olives on dark rye. I'll admit, not every experiment was successful, at least not for my grade school palate. But no matter what, it was different, and that made it special, just like my mother. While she cooked, she would often put Aretha Franklin on the record player, and I would dance and sing in the living room as though it were my stage. We listened to her version of To Be Young, Gifted, and Black all the time, an anthem of Black pride first performed by Nina Simone. Most of our conversations took place in the kitchen. Cooking and eating were among the things our family most often did together. When Maya and I were kids, our mother sometimes used to serve us what she called smorgasbord. She'd use a cookie cutter to make shapes and pieces of bread, then lay them out on a tray with mustard, mayonnaise, pickles, and fancy toothpicks. In between bread slices, we'd put whatever was left in the refrigerator from the previous nights of cooking. It took me years to clue into the fact that smorgasbord was really just leftovers. My mother had a way of making even the ordinary seem exciting. There was a lot of laughter, too. My mother was very fond of a puppet show called Punch and Judy, where Judy would chase Punch around with a rolling pin. She would laugh so hard when she pretended to chase us around the kitchen with hers. But it wasn't all laughs, of course. Saturday was chores day, and each of us had our assignments. And my mother could be tough. She had little patience for self-indulgence. My sister and I rarely earned praise for behavior or achievements that were expected. Why would I applaud you for something you were supposed to do? She would admonish if I tried to fish for compliments. And if I came home to report the latest drama in search of a sympathetic ear, my mother would have none of it. Her first reaction would be, "Well, what'd you do?" In retrospect, I see that what did you do? In retrospect, I see that she was trying to teach me that I had power and agency. Fair enough, but it still drove me crazy. But that toughness was always accompanied by unwavering love and loyalty and support. If Maya or I was having a bad day, or if the weather had been gray and depressing for too long, Branch is a stud. Is that Branch? Yeah. She would throw what she'd like to call an unbirthday party with unbirthday cake and unbirthday presents. Other times she'd make some of our favorite things, chocolate chip pancakes or her special K cereal cookies. K for Kamala. And often she would get out the sewing machine and make clothes for us or for our Barbies. She even let Maya and me pick out the color of the family car, a Dodge Dart that she drove everywhere. We chose yellow, our favorite color at the time, and if she regretted having empowered us with the decision, she never let on. On the plus side, it was always easy to find our car in a parking lot. 3 times a week, I would go up the street to Mrs. Jones' house. She was a classically trained pianist, but there weren't many options in the field for a black woman, so she became a piano teacher, and she was strict and serious. Every time I looked over at the clock to see how much time was left in the lesson, she would rap my knuckles with a ruler. Other nights, I would go over to Aunt Mary's house, and Uncle Sherman and I would play chess. He was a great player and loved to talk to me about the bigger implications of the game, the idea of being strategic, of having a plan, of thinking things through multiple steps ahead, of predicting your opponent's actions and adjusting yours to outmaneuver them. Every once in a while, he would let me win. On Sundays, our mother would send us off to the 23rd Avenue Church of God, piled with the other kids in the back of Mrs. Shelton's station wagon. My earliest memories of the teachings of the Bible were of a loving God, a God who asks us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to defend the rights of the poor and needy. This is where I learned that faith is a verb. I believe we must live our faith and show our faith in action. Maya and I sang in the children's choir, where my favorite hymn was Fill My Cup, Lord. I remember one Mother's Day we recited an ode to moms. Each of us posed as one of the letters in the word mother. I was cast as the letter T, and I stood there proudly, arms stretched out to both sides. T is for the time she cares for me and loves me in every way. My favorite night of the week was Thursday. On Thursdays, you could always find us in an unassuming beige building at the corner of what was then Grove Street in Derby. Once a mortuary, the building I knew was bursting with life, home to a pioneering black cultural center, Rainbow Sign. Rainbow Sign was a performance space, cinema, art gallery, dance studio, and more. It had a restaurant with a big kitchen, and somebody was always cooking up something delicious. Smothered chicken, meatballs and gravy, candied yams, cornbread, peach cobbler. By day, you could take classes in dance and foreign languages, or workshops in theater and art. At night, there were screenings, lectures, and performances from some of the most prominent black thinkers and leaders of the day. Musicians, painters, poets, writers, filmmakers, scholars, dancers, and politicians. Men and women at the vanguard of American culture and critical thought. Rainbow Sign was the brainchild of the visionary concert promoter Mary Ann Pollard, who started the center with 10 other black women in September 1971. Its name was inspired by the verse from the black spiritual, Mary Don't You Weep. The lyric, God gave no other rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time, was printed on the membership brochure. James Baldwin, of course, had memorably used this same verse for his book, The Fire Next Time. Baldwin was a close friend of Pollard's and a regular guest at the club. My mother, Maya, and I went to Rainbow Sign often. Everyone in the neighborhood knew us as Shyamala and the girls. We were a unit, a team, and when we'd show up, we were always greeted with big smiles and warm hugs. Rainbow Sign had a communal orientation and an inclusive vibe. It was a place designed to spread knowledge, awareness, and power. Its informal motto was for the love of people. Families with children were especially welcome at Rainbow Sign, an approach that reflected both the values and the vision of the women at its home. Pollard once told the journalist, "Hidden under everything we do, the best entertainment we put on, there's always a message. Look about you. Think about this. The center hosted a program specifically for kids through high school age, which included not only arts education, but also a parallel version of the adult programming, in which young people could meet and interact directly with the center's guest speakers and performers. The Bay Area was home to so many extraordinary black leaders, and was bursting with black pride in some places. People had migrated there from all over the country. This meant that kids like me who spent time at Rainbow Sign were exposed to dozens of extraordinary men and women who showed us what we could become. In 1971, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm paid a visit while she was exploring a run for president. Talk about strength. Unbought and unbossed, just as her campaign slogan promised. Alice Walker, who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple, did a reading at Rainbow Sign. So did Maya Angelou, the first black female best-selling author, thanks to her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Nina Simone performed at Rainbow Sign when I was 7 years old. I would later learn that Warren Widener, Berkeley's first black mayor, proclaimed March 31st, 1972, Nina Simone Day to commemorate her 2-day appearance. I love the electric atmosphere at Rainbow Sign, the laughter, the food, the energy. I love the powerful orations from the stage and the witty, sometimes unruly audience banter. It was where I learned that artistic expression, ambition, and intelligence were cool. It was where I came to understand that there is no better way to feed someone's brain than by bringing together food, poetry, politics, music, dance, and art. It was also where I saw the logical extension of my mother's daily lessons, where I could begin to imagine what my future might hold for me. My mother was raising us to believe that it's too hard was never an acceptable excuse, that being a good person meant standing for something larger than yourself, that success is measured in part by what you help others achieve and accomplish. She would tell us, fight systems in a way that causes them to be fairer, and don't be limited by what has always been. At Rainbow Sign, I'd see those values in action, those principles personified. It was a citizen's upbringing, the only kind I knew, and one I assumed everyone else was experiencing too. I was happy just where I was, but when I was in middle school, we had to leave. My mother was offered a unique opportunity in Montreal, teaching at McGill University and conducting research at the Jewish General Hospital. It was an exciting step in advancing her career. It was not, however, an exciting opportunity for me. I was 12 years old and thought of moving away from sunny California in February in the middle of the school year to a French-speaking foreign city covered in 12 feet of snow was distressing, to say the least. My mother tried to make it sound like an adventure, taking us to buy our first down jackets and mittens, as though we were going to be explorers of the great northern winter. But it was hard for me to see it that way. It was made worse when my mother told us that she wanted us to learn the language, so she was enrolling us in a neighborhood school for native French speakers. Notre Dame de Neiges, Our Lady of the Snows. It was a difficult transition, since the only French I knew was from my ballet classes, where Madame Bovie, my ballet teacher, would shout, demi-plie, demi-plie, and up. I used to joke that I felt like a duck, because all day long at our new school I'd be saying, quoi, 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 quack, 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 quack. What? But it sounds like a duck, because it's like quack, get it? I was sure to take my upbringing with me to Montreal. One day, Maya and I held the demonstration in front of our building, protesting the fact that kids weren't allowed to play soccer on the lawn. I'm happy to report that our demands were met. Eventually, I convinced my mother to let me switch to a fine arts school, where I tried out violin, French horn, and kettle drum alongside my studies in history and math. One year, we performed Free to Be You and Me from start to finish. By the time I got to high school, I had adjusted to our new surroundings. I still missed home, my friends and family, and was always so happy to return during the summer and holidays, when we'd stay with my father or Mrs. Shelton, but I'd gotten used to most of it. What I hadn't gotten used to was the feeling of being homesick for my country. I felt this constant sense of yearning to be back home. There was no question in my mind I'd return home for college. I invited both of my parents to come to my graduation, even though I knew they wouldn't speak to each other. I still wanted them both to be there for me. I'll never forget sitting in the first couple of rows of the auditorium, looking out at the audience. My mother was nowhere to be found. Where is she? I thought. Is she not here because my father is? We were about to get started, and then, all of a sudden, the back door of the auditorium opened, and my mother, who most days wore jeans and tennis shoes to her lab, walked in wearing a very bright red dress and heels. She was never one to let the situation get the better of her. During high school, I started thinking more concretely about my future, college and beyond. I'd always assumed I would have a career. I'd seen the satisfaction my parents derived from their work. I'd also seen a series of extraordinary women, Aunt Mary, Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Shelton, and my mother most of all, leading in their respective fields of influence, and the difference they were making in others' lives. Though the seed was planted very early on, I'm not sure when exactly, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. Some of my greatest heroes were lawyers: Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, Constance Baker Motley, giants of the civil rights movement. I cared a lot about fairness, and I saw that law as a tool that can help make things fair. But I think what most drew me to the profession was the way people around me trusted and relied on lawyers. Uncle Sherman and our close friend Henry were lawyers, and anytime someone had a problem within the family or the neighborhood, the first thing you'd hear was call Henry, call Sherman. They'll know what to do. They'll know how to make sense of this. I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to be the one people called. I wanted to be the one who could help. So when it came to college, I wanted to get off on the right foot. And what better place to do that, I thought, than at Thurgood Marshall's alma mater. I had always heard stories about what a wonderful place Howard University was, especially from Aunt Chris, who had gone there. Howard is an institution with an extraordinary legacy, one that has endured and thrived since its founding, 2 years after the Civil War. It endured when the doors of higher education were largely closed to black students. It endured when segregation and discrimination were the law of the land. It endured when few recognized the potential and capacity of young black men and women to be leaders. Generations of students had been nurtured and edified at Howard, equipped with the confidence to aim high and the tools to make the climb. I wanted to be one of them. In the fall of 1982, I moved into Eton Towers, my first college dorm. Eton? I'm not sure. I'll always remember walking into Crampton Auditorium for my freshman orientation. The room was packed. I stood in the back, looked around, and thought, this is heaven. There were hundreds of people, and everyone looked like me. Some were children of Howard alumni. Others were the first in their families to go to college. Some had been in predominantly black schools in their whole lives. Others had long been one of only a few people of color in their classroom or their neighborhood. Some came from cities, some from rural communities, and some from African countries, the Caribbean, and throughout the African diaspora. As was the case for most Howard students, my favorite place to hang out was an area we called the Yard, a grass-covered space the size of a city block, right smack in the middle of the heart of the campus. Right smack in the heart of the campus. On any given day, you could stand in the middle of the yard and see, on your right, young dancers practicing their steps or musicians playing instruments. Look to your left, and there were briefcase-toting students strolling out in the business school, and medical students in their white coats heading back to the lab. Groups of students might be in a circle of laughter or locked in deep discussion. A columnist for the Hilltop, the school newspaper, with the star of the football team. A gospel choir singer with the president of the math club. That was the beauty of Howard. Every signal told students that we could be anything, that we were young, gifted, and black, and we shouldn't let anything get in the way of our success. The campus was a place where you didn't have to be confined to the box of another person's choosing. At Howard, you could come as you were and leave as the person you aspired to be. There were no false choices. We weren't just told we had the capacity to be great, we were challenged to live up to that potential. There was an expectation that we would cultivate and use our talents to take on roles of leadership and have an impact on other people, on our country, maybe even on the world. I dove in with gusto. Freshman year, I ran for my first elected office, freshman class representative of the Liberal Arts Student Council. It was my very first campaign. No opponent I've faced since was as tough as Jersey girl Shelley Young, and that says a lot coming from a person from Oakland. I chaired the Economic Society and competed on the debate team. I pledged a sorority, my beloved Alpha Kappa Alpha, founded by 9 women at Howard more than a century ago. On Fridays, my friends and I would dress up in our best clothes and peacock around the yard. On weekends, we went down to the National Mall to protest apartheid in South Africa. While at Howard, in addition to being a student, I had many jobs. I interned at the Federal Trade Commission, where I was responsible for clips, which meant combing all the morning newspapers, cutting out any articles that mentioned the agency, and pasting them onto sheets of paper to copy and distribute to senior staff. I also did research in the National Archives and was a tour guide at the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. My fellow tour guides and I were all given walkie-talkies and ID numbers. I was TG-10, a code name that made me feel like a Secret Service agent. Once I emerged from my shift to find Ruby D and Ossie Davis in the main area, waiting for a VIP tour after hours. They projected an aura like the luminaries they were, yet they made a special point of engaging me in conversation and telling me that it made them proud to see me as a young black woman working in public service. I've never forgotten how it made me feel as a young person to have these two icons, both larger than life, take the time to show an interest in me. In the summer of my sophomore year, I got an internship with Senator Alan Cranston of California. Who could have known that some 30 years later I'd be elected to the same Senate seat? I still have framed the thank you letter from his office manager, which hangs in my Senate office near where my own interns sit. When I find myself riding the Senate subway with interns, I often tell them, you're looking at your future. I loved going to the Capitol building every day that summer for work. It felt like the epicenter of change, and even as an intern sorting mail, I was thrilled to be a part of it. But I was even more mesmerized by the Supreme Court building across the street. I would walk across the street in the hot, humid summer when you could cut the air with a butter knife, just so I could stand in awe of its magnificence and read the words engraved in marble above its entrance. equal justice under law. I imagined a world where that might be. After Howard, I returned home to Oakland and enrolled at UC Hastings College of the Law. I was elected president of the Black Law Students Association during my second year in law school. At the time, black students were having a harder time finding employment than white students, and I wanted to change that. As BLSA president, I called the managing partners of all the major law firms and asked them to send representatives to a job fair we were hosting at a hotel. When I realized that I wanted to work in the district attorney's office, that I had found my calling, I was excited to share the decision with my friends and family, and I wasn't surprised to find them incredulous. I had to defend my choice as one would a thesis. America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I knew this history well, of innocent men framed, of charges brought against people of color without sufficient evidence, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants, of the disproportionate application of the law. I grew up with these stories, so I understood my community's wariness, but history told another story too. I knew the history of brave prosecutors who went after the Ku Klux Klan in the South. I knew the stories of prosecutors who went after corrupt politicians and corporate polluters. I knew the legacy of Robert Kennedy, who as U.S. Attorney General sent Department of Justice officials to protect the Freedom Riders in 1961 and sent the U.S. Marshals to protect James Meredith when he enrolled at Ole Miss the next year. They're currently getting dog-walked by UGA. I knew quite well that equal justice was an aspiration. I knew that the force of the law was applied unevenly, sometimes by design. But I also knew that what was wrong with the system didn't need to be an immutable fact, and I wanted to be part of changing that. One of my mother's favorite sayings was, "Don't let anybody tell you who you are. You tell them who you are." And so I did. I knew part of making change was what I'd seen all my life, surrounded by adults shouting and marching and demanding justice from the outside. But I also knew there was an important role on the inside, sitting at the table where decisions were being made. When activists came marching and banging on the doors, I wanted to be on the other side to let them in. I was going to be a prosecutor in my own image. I was going to do the job through the lens of my own experiences and perspectives, from wisdom gained at my mother's knee, in Rainbow Science Hall, and on the Howard Yard. An important part of what that wisdom told me was that when it came to criminal justice, we were being asked to accept false choices. For too long, we've been told there were only two options, to be either tough on crime or soft on crime, an oversimplification that ignored the realities of public safety. You can want the police to stop crime in your neighborhood and also want them to stop using excessive force. You can want them to hunt down a killer on your streets and also want them to stop using racial profiling. You can believe in the need for consequence and accountability, especially for serious criminals, and also oppose unjust incarceration. I believed it was essential to weave all these varied strands together. At the end of my summer internship, I was thrilled to accept the position as Deputy District Attorney. All I had to do was finish my final year of law school and take the bar exam, and then I'd be able to start my career in the courtroom. I finished law school in the spring of 1989 and took the bar exam in July. In the waning weeks of summer, my future seemed so bright and so clear. The countdown to the life I imagined had begun. And then with a jolt, I was stopped in my tracks. In November, the state bar sent letters out to those who had taken the exam, and to my utter devastation, I had failed. I couldn't get my head around it. It was almost too much to bear. My mother had always told me, don't do anything half-assed, and I had always taken that to heart. I was a hard worker, a perfectionist, someone who didn't take things for granted. But there I was, letter in hand, realizing that in studying for the bar, I had put forward the most half-assed performance of my life. Fortunately, I still had a job in the district attorney's office. They were going to keep me on with clerk duties and give me space to study to retake the exam in February. I was grateful for that, but it was hard to go into the office feeling inadequate and incompetent. Just about everyone else who had been hired along with me had passed, and they were going to move on with their training without me. I remember walking by someone's office and hearing them say to someone else, "But she's so smart. How could she not have passed?" I felt miserable and embarrassed. I wondered if people thought I was a fraud. But I held my head up and kept going to work every day, and I passed on my second attempt. I was so proud and so honored the day I was sworn in as an officer of the court, and I showed up at the courthouse ready to start the work. But as it turns out, neither law school nor the bar exam really teach you what to do in court, and in those early days, it can feel like you've landed on another planet, where everyone speaks the language but you. As a clerk, you can represent the people in court under supervision, but this was the first time I'd be in trial on my own. I prepared, going over the facts of the case a dozen times. I'd practiced the questions I wanted to ask, internalized the precise wording of my legal motions. I'd researched and rehearsed every practice and custom, down to the skirt suit that was de rigueur, for female attorneys, back before women were permitted to wear pants in the courtroom. I'd done everything I could. Still, the stakes were so high, it never felt like enough. I walked into the courtroom, down the gallery aisle, and past the pews to the bar that separates defendants, families, witnesses, and other spectators from officials of the court. Chairs were arrayed in front of the bar for lawyers waiting for their cases to be called, and I took my seat among them. Nerves, excitement, and adrenaline jockeyed for position in my mind, but most of all, I was honored by and conscious of the immense responsibility I held. the duty to protect those who are among the most vulnerable and voiceless members of our society. When my turn came, I rose from my chair at the prosecutor's desk and stepped up to the podium, saying the words every prosecutor speaks. Kamala Harris for the people. The reason we have public offices of prosecution in America is that in our country, a crime against any one of us, or against any of us, is considered a crime against all of us. Almost by definition, our criminal justice system involves matters in which the powerful has harmed the less powerful. And we do not expect the weaker party to secure justice alone. We make it a collective endeavor. That's why prosecutors don't represent the victim. They represent the people, society at large. I kept that principle front and center as I worked with victims, whose dignity and safety were always paramount for me. It takes an enormous amount of courage for someone to share their story and endure cross-examination, knowing their credibility and most personal details may be on the line. But when they take the stand, they are doing so for the benefit of all of us, so that there will be consequences and accountability for those who violate the law. For the people was my compass, and there was nothing I took more seriously than the power I now possessed. As an individual prosecutor, I had the discretion to decide whether to bring charges against someone, and if so, what and how many charges to bring. I can negotiate plea agreements and provide sentencing and bail recommendations to the court. I was just starting out as a prosecutor, and yet I had the power to deprive a person of their liberty with a swipe of my pen. When it came time for closing arguments, I approached the jury box. I decided to do it without notes, so I wouldn't be looking down at a piece of paper, reading off my best arguments for why they should convict the defendant. I wanted to look the jurors in the eye. I felt that I should know my case well. I felt that I should know my case well enough that I could close my eyes and see the entire incident in 360 degrees. As I finished my closing and headed back to the prosecutor's table, I caught a glimpse of the audience. Amy Resner, my friend from the first day of orientation, was sitting there with a big smile on her face, cheering me on. Now we were both on our way. The daily work was intense. At any given time, an individual prosecutor might be juggling more than 100 cases. We started with lower-level work, arguing preliminary hearings, doing misdemeanor trials that covered things like DUIs and petty thefts. As the years passed, I got more and more trials under my belt and moved my way up the hierarchy of the office. In time, I would start prosecuting violent felonies, which took the work to a whole new level. I would pore over police reports and interview witnesses. I would sit with the coroner and go through autopsy photographs, always cognizant that I was looking at somebody's child or parent. When police arrested a suspect, I would go down to the police station and stand on the other side of a two-way mirror and pass notes back and forth with investigators conducting the interview. Once I started prosecuting felonies, I was assigned to homicide duty. I'd be given a briefcase on a Friday afternoon containing a paper, high-tech for the early 90s, a pen and pad, a pager containing a pager, high-tech for the early 90s, a pen and pad, a copy of the penal code, and a list of critical numbers to call. For the next week, whenever the pager went off, it meant there had been a homicide and I was needed at the scene. Usually that meant keeping out of bed between midnight and 6 a.m. Usually that meant leaping out of bed between midnight and 6 a.m. My role was to make sure the evidence was collected in the proper way with all appropriate constitutional protections intact so that it would be admissible in court. I often had to explain to victims and their families that there was a difference between what we knew happened and what we could prove happened. There is a giant chasm between arrest and conviction, and if you want to get from one to the other, you need legally obtained evidence. I was at home in the courtroom. I understood its rhythm. I was comfortable with its idiosyncrasies. Eventually, I moved into a unit that focused on prosecuting sex crimes, putting rapists and child molesters behind bars. It was difficult, distressing, and deeply important work. I met so many girls and sometimes boys who had been abused, assaulted, neglected, all too often by people in relationships of trust. What made these cases especially difficult was what was often needed to get a conviction, having the assault survivor testify. I spent a lot of those days meeting with survivors at Oakland's Highland General Hospital, walking them through what it would mean to take the stand, what that experience would be like. For some survivors, it was simply unimaginable to get on the witness stand and speak publicly about something they didn't even want to speak about privately. There is so much pain and anguish associated with having experienced sexual violence. Containing that kind of emotional trauma, to take the stand requires an extraordinary amount of courage and fortitude, especially when your abuser is also in the courtroom, when that abuser may be a family member or a friend, and knowing you will be cross-examined by defense counsel, whose job it is to convince the jury that you aren't telling the truth. I never faulted those who couldn't bring themselves to go through with it. Often, as in the cases of the youngest children, the challenge of getting a conviction came down to the ability to testify as much as the willingness. Those were the cases that haunted me. The ability, just to emphasize here, came down to the ability to testify as much as the willingness. Those were the cases that haunted me most. I'll never forget a tiny, quiet 6-year-old girl who was being molested by her 16-year-old brother. It was my job to sit with that sweet little child and see if I could get her to tell me her story, and whether she would be able to tell it again in front of a jury. I spent a lot of time with her, playing with toys, playing games, trying to build a relationship of trust. But as much as I tried, I just knew that there was no way she could articulate to a jury what she had suffered. I remember walking out of the room and into a bathroom, where I broke down and cried. I wasn't going to have enough evidence to charge her brother. Without her testimony, I'd never be able to prove the allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite all that prosecutorial power, I'm not sure I've ever felt quite so powerless. These were just some of the challenges of defending children from sexual predators. There was also the jury itself, which sometimes seemed more inclined to believe adults than children. This was especially the case when it came to sexually exploited youth. I often think of a case I had involving a 14-year-old who had run away from her foster home with a group of young men from her neighborhood. Instead of being her allies and protectors, they'd taken her to an empty apartment and gang raped her. I could tell that she had learned at a young age that she couldn't trust adults. She wore an attitude of skepticism and hostility like a suit of armor. I felt for that poor girl, and the horrific childhood that had led her to this moment. But I was also acutely aware of how the jury might perceive her as she entered the courtroom, chewing gum, potentially coming off as almost contemptuous of the process. I worried. Would they see her as the child she was, as an innocent victim of serial abuse, or would they simply write her off as someone dressed inappropriately, who had it coming? Jurors are human beings, with human responses and reactions. I knew I had to meet them where they were, as if I was to have any chance of moving them to more than just interpretation of the facts. I could see they weren't responding to her well. They didn't seem to like her. The penal code was not created to protect some of us, I reminded the jury. It is for all of us. This girl is a child. She needs to be protected from predators who are going to pounce. And one of the reasons the defendants picked her as their victim is that they thought you wouldn't care about her enough to believe her. In the end, we got a conviction, but I'm not sure the verdict meant much to the girl. She vanished after the trial. I asked some investigators to help me try to find her, but though we had gotten a sketchy report that she was being trafficked on the streets of San Francisco, we could never confirm it. I never saw her again. It was hard not to feel the weight of the systemic problems we were up against. Putting this young girl's abusers in prison meant they wouldn't be able to hurt other children. But what about the one they had already gotten their hands on? How had our system helped her? A conviction was never going to make her whole, nor was it enough to get her out of the cycle of violence in which she was trapped. That reality, and what to do about it, bounced back and forth in my head, sometimes in the back of my mind, sometimes at the front of my skull. But it would be a few years before I could tackle it head on. In 1998, after 9 years in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, I was recruited across the bay to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. I was hired to run the Career Criminal Unit, which focused on violent and serial offenders. I was hesitant to go at first, and not just because I loved working in the Alameda County Courthouse. At the time, the San Francisco DA's office had a dubious reputation. I was concerned by stories of dysfunction in the office. At the same time, it was a promotion. I would be running a unit, overseeing a team of prosecutors. This was a chance to grow. Plus, my friend and mentor, Dick Eigelhart, who was then the Chief Assistant District Attorney, was actively encouraging me to come. With some trepidation, I accepted the offer, and soon found that my concerns had been warranted. The office was a mess. Just one computer for every 2 lawyers, no filing system, and no database to track cases. It was rumored that when attorneys were finished with a case, some would toss the files in the trash. This was the late 1990s, and yet the office still didn't have email. There was also a huge backlog of cases that were languishing, uninvestigated, unprosecuted. Lawyers were frustrated with the police for not investigating cases. Police were frustrated with the district attorney because his office was failing to get convictions. The decisions being made at the top appeared to be arbitrary and random, and staff morale was close to rock bottom. That toxic environment was made even worse by a series of firings. One Friday, 14 lawyers came back from lunch to find pink slips on their chairs. It was devastating. People cried and yelled, and soon their fear turned into paranoia. Lawyers were afraid of one another, afraid of backstabbing by colleagues trying to protect their own jobs. Some people started skipping out on the goodbye parties of their fired compatriots, worried that their attendance would mark them as targets for firing too. It was incredibly frustrating, and not just in terms of the day-to-day work. I believe the district attorney was undercutting the whole idea of what a progressive prosecutor could be. My vision of a progressive prosecutor was someone who used the power of the office with a sense of fairness, perspective, and experience. Someone who was clear about the need to hold serious criminals accountable and who understood that the best way to create safe communities was to prevent crime in the first place. To do those things effectively, you also need to run a professional operation. After 18 months, I got a lifeline. The San Francisco City Attorney, Renee, I'm not sure, called me with a job offer. Louise was the first woman to hold that office. She was a groundbreaker, and she was fearless, taking on entrenched interests ranging from gun manufacturers and tobacco companies to male-only clubs. There was an opening to lead the division in her office that handled child and family services. She wanted to know if I'd be interested. I told her I would take the job, but that I didn't just want to be a lawyer dealing with individual cases. I wanted to work on policy that could improve the system as a whole. Too often, young people in foster care migrated to juvenile detention and then into the adult criminal system. I wanted to work on policies that would stem that devastating flow. Louise was all for it. I spent 2 years in the city at the city attorney's office. I started by co-founding a task force to study the issues of sexually exploited youth. We put together a group of experts, survivors, and community members to help guide the work, a series of recommendations that we would present to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Norma Hodling was my partner in that effort. She had firsthand experience with the challenges we were tackling. She had been abused as a girl and ended up homeless and addicted to heroin. She was arrested for prostitution more than 30 times, but hers was one of the few such stories that have a happy ending. Norma got clean. She went to college. She got a degree in health education. And as soon as she graduated, she put that degree to use, creating a program designed to rescue women from the prosecution that is widely replicated today. I couldn't think of a better person to have teamed up with, and I admire her for having the courage to tell her story and put it to use for the benefit of so many others. One of our priorities was creating a safe space for prostituted youth to get love and support and treatment. I knew from years of experience that the survivors we were trying to help usually had nowhere to go. In most cases, their parents weren't in the picture. Many of them had run away from foster care. People often wondered why it was that exploited kids picked up by the police would go right back to the pimps or older prostitutes who took care of them. It didn't seem so strange to me. Where else were these kids able to turn? Our task force proposed establishing a safe house for sexually exploited youth, a sanctuary that would offer substance abuse and mental health treatment, the resources needed to get back to school, and a network of support to keep vulnerable young people safe, happy, and on track. We advocated for funding to create the safe house as well as to run a public education campaign. We put posters up in public bathrooms and on buses where at-risk youth would be able to get the information they needed without their pimp hovering over them. We also believed it was important to disrupt the network of brothels masquerading as massage parlors where so many people were being sexually exploited. So we asked the Board of Supervisors to direct law enforcement to investigate them as one of their top priorities. To our delight, the Board of Superiors adopted and funded our recommendations. We were able to rescue scores of runaways in the first couple of years. Law enforcement, meanwhile, shut down nearly 36 brothels in the city. The work was meaningful, empowering, and proof that I could do serious policy work without being a legislator. It also boosted my confidence that when I saw problems, I could be the one to help devise the solutions. All those times my mother had pressed me, "Well, what did you do?" suddenly made a lot more sense. I had realized I didn't have to wait for someone else to take the lead. I could start making things happen on my own. I think it was that realization that turned my sights to elected office. Of all the problems I saw in front of me, few were in more urgent need of fixing than the district attorney's office. While we were making important gains at the city attorney's office, the district attorney's office was self-destructing. Talented career prosecutors were seeing their efforts undervalued and feeling stymied in the vital work to which they devoted their lives. Meanwhile, violent felons were walking free. I knew this, we all knew this, but suddenly it wasn't just an important problem to be solved. It was an important problem I could solve. I wanted to honor, support, and empower the DA's office as a whole. But in order to run the office, I would have to run for office. A political campaign would be a huge undertaking and one I clearly couldn't embark upon lightly. I turned to my friends, my family, my colleagues, my mentors. We had long, animated debates, another thesis to defend. We weighed the pros and cons, and then we weighed them all again. People were generally supportive of the idea, but they were worried too. My would-be opponent and former boss was already a household name. He also had a reputation as a fighter. In fact, his nickname was KO, as in KO, a tribute to the many knockouts he'd scored in his boxing youth. A campaign would be not only bruising, but also expensive, and I had no experience as a fundraiser. Was this really the time for me to run? I had no way of knowing. But more and more I was coming to feel that wait and see wasn't an option. I thought of James Baldwin, whose words had defined so much of the civil rights struggle. "There is never a time in the future for which we will work out our salvation," he'd written. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now.